Noam Chomsky's Pirates and Emperors, Old and New, International Terrorism in the Real World, first published in 1986, with updated editions, is a critical examination of the concept of terrorism, particularly how it is framed and understood in the context of international relations. Chomsky explores the distinctions between what is labeled as terrorism, when carried out by non-state actors, versus state-sponsored violence, often by powerful nations like the United States. The title itself alludes to a famous anecdote involving Alexander the Great, where a captured pirate tells the emperor that the only difference between them is scale. One attacks with a small ship and is called a pirate, while the other attacks with a large fleet and is called an emperor. The book is divided into sections that scrutinize historical and contemporary examples of what Chomsky terms international terrorism. He challenges the conventional narratives presented by Western governments and media, arguing that they often obscure or justify state-sponsored violence, while demonizing similar acts committed by less powerful groups. Chomsky's analysis is deeply rooted in his critique of American foreign policy, particularly in the post-World War I era. He contends that the American government has engaged in or supported numerous acts of violence and repression across the globe, which, if committed by other actors, would be labeled as terrorism. By examining these cases, Chomsky aims to expose the double standards and hypocrisy in how terrorism is defined and prosecuted. One of the central arguments in Pirates and Emperors is that the American government has systematically employed or supported terrorism to achieve its geopolitical goals. Chomsky provides detailed accounts of U.S. interventions in Latin America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, where American forces or their proxies have engaged in actions that resulted in mass casualties and the destabilization of entire regions. For instance, Chomsky discusses America's support for repressive regimes in Latin America during the Cold War, such as the backing of military dictatorships in countries like Chile, Argentina, and El Salvador. These regimes carried out widespread human rights abuses, including torture, assassination, and disappearances, often with the tacit or explicit support of the U.S. government. Chomsky argues that these actions constitute terrorism by any reasonable definition, yet they are rarely described as such in mainstream discourse. In the Middle East, Chomsky highlights the American alliance with Israel and its consequences for Palestinian civilians. He points to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, particularly the massacre of Palestinians in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, as an example of state terrorism that was either ignored or downplayed by Western media and governments. Chomsky asserts that U.S. support for Israeli military actions, which often result in civilian casualties, further exemplifies the double standards in defining terrorism. A significant portion of Pirates and Emperors is devoted to analyzing how the media shapes public perception of terrorism. Chomsky argues that mainstream media in the West, particularly in the United States, often acts as a propaganda tool for the government, selectively reporting on or ignoring incidents of state-sponsored violence, depending on who the perpetrator is. Chomsky's concept of worthy and unworthy victims is central to this analysis. He suggests that when victims of violence are associated with American allies or Western interests, they are given extensive media coverage and portrayed as innocent, deserving of sympathy and justice. Conversely, when the victims are from countries or groups opposed to America's interests, their suffering is minimized or ignored. This selective reporting, according to Chomsky, serves to perpetuate the dominant narrative that justifies state-sponsored terrorism while vilifying non-state actors. For example, Chomsky contrasts the extensive coverage of terrorist attacks against Western targets, such as the hijackings and bombings by Palestinian groups, with the relative silence on the far greater scale of violence inflicted by American allies in the Middle East. He also critiques the media's portrayal of American military interventions as defensive or humanitarian, even when they result in significant civilian casualties. In later editions of Pirates and Emperors, Chomsky addresses the post-9/11 discourse on terrorism, particularly the notion of a clash of civilizations, popularized by scholars like Samuel Huntington. Chomsky argues that this framework is not only misleading, but also dangerous, as it simplifies complex geopolitical issues into a binary struggle between the civilized West and the barbaric East. Chomsky contends that this narrative serves to legitimize the expansion of American military power under the guise of fighting terrorism. He critiques the global war on terror as a continuation of earlier patterns of American foreign policy, where acts of violence by America or its allies are justified as necessary for the defense of civilization, while similar acts by others are condemned as terrorism. Chomsky also discusses the role of intellectuals in shaping and challenging the dominant narratives around terrorism. He argues that many intellectuals in the West have either actively supported or passively accepted the American government's justifications for its actions, often out of a desire to maintain their status and access to power. However, Chomsky also highlights the importance of dissenting voices, who challenge these narratives and expose the reality of state-sponsored terrorism. Chomsky himself is a prominent example of such dissent, using his platform as a scholar and public intellectual to criticize American foreign policy and advocate for a more just and equitable world order. He calls on other intellectuals to join in this effort, arguing that they have a responsibility to speak out against injustice and hold governments accountable for their actions. Pirates and Emperors, Old and New, is a powerful critique of the way terrorism is understood and discussed in international relations. By examining the historical and contemporary examples of U.S. foreign policy, Chomsky exposes the double standards and hypocrisy in how terrorism is defined and prosecuted. He challenges readers to question the narratives presented by governments and the media, and to recognize the ways in which state-sponsored violence is often justified or ignored. Chomsky's work remains highly relevant in today's geopolitical landscape, where the discourse on terrorism continues to shape international relations and domestic policies. His analysis encourages a more critical and nuanced understanding of terrorism, one that acknowledges the complex realities of power, violence, and propaganda in the modern world.